What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stochastic channel. And it's finally here, college football season. That means college football DFS breakdowns. We will be discussing week 0. It's a 3-game slate. Before we get into that, make sure you hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. And we are brought to you by Bet365. Right now, they have a deal where you can get $5, bet $5, and get $150 in bonus bets, whether it wins or loses. All you have to do is bet a game. Pick a college football game, perhaps. There's a nice slate of games this weekend. You can take SMU, Georgia Tech, Hawaii, anything you like. It's available in Kentucky, Ohio, New Jersey, Virginia, Iowa, Colorado, Louisiana, Indiana, Arizona, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. You must be 21 or older to play, 18 in Kentucky. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, please call or text 1-800-GAMBLER. All right. So the data sheet is not up just quite yet. We start bringing that live after week 1 when we actually have data to show you. So we'll be workshopping this as we go. What I think I'm going to do is show you guys the projection screen. These are going to change. It's Wednesday morning. Between now and Saturday, of course, but we have an early look at projections, and yeah, I think this is just going to be the best way to do this until we get the data sheet back. So let's dive in. We're going to go game by game through the 3 that we have, and we'll start with the Georgia Tech Florida State game being played in Dublin. So here's our projection screen. If you want this, it is available on Stochastic. This game being played overseas, it has a spread currently of 10 points in favor of Florida State. I say currently because it has really ping-ponged all over the place over the last couple of days. Florida State was minus 12.5, and they're minus 10. It's going to finish probably somewhere in between 12.5 and 10. I'm not sure where it goes from here. The total's 55. All of the totals on this 3-game slate are within 1.5 points of each other. It is a very tight slate. The lowest is 54.5. The highest is 56.5. So not much to see there. But with Florida State, we have the 3rd highest implied team total. Georgia Tech, we have the 4th. I'll start with the quarterback position, as you can see on the screen. Sorry if this isn't big enough. I'll read as much as I can to you guys too. Or I'll just blow it up one more spot for the Zoom. That looks a little better. Okay, we'll use this. It's DJ Uiagalelei for Florida State. He'll be dueling against our friend Haynes King, who returns for Georgia Tech. The prices on these guys are $9K flat for Uiagalelei and 7.1 for Haynes King. So as you can see, the projection difference isn't vast between the two of them, even with the difference in spread. So as this line has come down, it has made Haynes King more of a value and Uiagalelei less of a value. To break down their games, with Oregon State, Uiagalelei had very good stats, 57% completion, 8.4 yards per attempt, 21 scores, only 7 picks. But the offense didn't ask him to do a lot. Only 9 turnover-worthy plays all year was pretty decent. 3.8 yards per carry in 2022, 3.2 last year. But the volume wasn't great, just 219 yards. So this is a player that has been sort of the victim of run-heavy attacks, offenses that aren't asking him to do a lot on the ground, or with his arm, more or less game managing his way to productive stat lines, giving you a good floor but a questionable ceiling. Is that going to be the case with Florida State? Florida State had a pass rate of 50% last year, but that was with Jordan Travis. And now we move to a quarterback who I'm not sure the staff feels the same about. I think they're comfortable with Uiagalelei. But if you look back to Florida State years prior, they did have to hide Travis for a number of years. So they're familiar with a quarterback who has limitations. Travis had extreme growth throughout his career. Perhaps Uiagalelei has the same. But right now, based on this team total and dropping the pass rate for Florida State compared to where they had last year, about 4%, we get a projection on him that is around 20 points flat. When you parallel that with Haynes King, this is going to be a much better value proposition for King. If you just look at rushing attempts, what this Georgia Tech offense asked him to do, it is vastly, vastly different. This is a player that has dynamic mobility. He rushed for 737 yards last year. That's 6.1 yards per carry. He was the 31st most efficient quarterback in all of college football, completed 61.5% of his passes, 7.7 yards per attempt, 27 scores, and 16 interceptions. So the volume is there, and he gives you an excellent floor with his rushing ability. Money coming in on Georgia Tech has reduced the spread, and it has made Canes King a better value and increases projections slightly as this projects to be a much closer game than we expect. There are weapons for Georgia Tech as well. We'll talk about some of the receivers in a little bit. Their stack in general is much cheaper than what you have to spend on the Florida State stack. But they're also going to be a little run heavier. Last year, their pass rate was just 44%. They were fast, 45th in pace, so that's something to consider too. But ultimately, we're dealing with two of the better quarterback options on this slate. I think even if you just start your builds with at least one of them in the quarterback spot, or both, use one of the super flex, you're going to be off to a pretty good start. But I want, generally speaking, looking at one quarterback from this game. We'll go to the running back position for this Florida State Georgia Tech contest. The top projection actually belongs to Jamal Haynes, and this makes a lot of sense to me, even when you just look at props for this game. The rushing props are almost identical between Roydell Williams, the Florida State running back, and Jamal Haynes, the Georgia Tech running back. They're both projected just north of 70 yards. So immediately the projection should be similar, but then there's a big difference in pass down work for these two teams. Jamal Haynes is used as basically a bell cow for this team. He's a player that is very involved in pass game situations, whereas Roydell Williams goes to a backfield that has Lawrence Toafili, who is a pass game specialist. As you can see, Lawrence Toafili has a pretty decent projection himself. Florida State used a timeshare last year with Trey Benson, who ended up being a very high NFL draft pick, and that was because they had Toafili on the field. Now they bring in another transfer in Jalen Lucas. His projection, 5.5 or 5.4 yards or DK points, I should say. He should be involved in this offense too, and that doesn't even factor in players like Keziah Holmes, who may get a carry here and there, Samuel Singleton. So you're looking at a situation with Florida State where it is likely to be a committee and likely to involve three backs to some degree. Roydell Williams being the 1A, the early down pounder. He's the Alabama transfer. Toafili being a threat on third downs and pass catching situations, and Lucas handling the change of pace work. Whereas Georgia Tech, you just don't have that. You have Trey Cooley as the change of pace, but Jamal Haynes is going to handle most of the workload. And this is a guy that had an excellent season receiving as well. So he immediately stands out as a play we want to get to. I still like using one of the Florida State backs just because they are 10-point favorites. Georgia Tech's defense was not good last year. There's a lot of optimism that they'll improve. They were 92nd, but we're talking about a team that was 111th against the run. Even if they make strides, are they going to really climb to a top 20 unit? I'm just not so sure that that's the case. So still very willing to use an FSU back. I guess one thing I should have mentioned at the top, building early lineups, salary on DraftKings specifically is not a huge factor. I had no real issues playing just about anyone I wanted. You need to make a concession here and there, but it is extremely easy to fit these players in your lineups. So playing a Florida State back and Jamal Haynes, playing a lot of this game in general, I think makes some sense. And we'll talk about reasons why as we get to the other games, but this is one of my favorites for sure. All right, the pass catching position. Whoops, that is teams. We want to go to wide receiver and tight ends. Okay, so at the top of the board, we have Eric Singleton, Malik Benson. I'm going to talk about these team by team first and foremost before we go anywhere else. And let's start with Florida State because they have the more interesting receiver situation given their departures. No Johnny Wilson, no Keon Coleman. What do? They went out and they added Malik Benson, who is from Alabama. And they went out and they added Jaylen Brown from LSU, who doesn't have a lot of experience, but he is a very high recruit. They were listed as starters on the depth chart, as was Ja'Kai Douglas. Behind them, you had backups of Deuce Spann, Darian Williamson, Kentron Poitier, and Hakeem Williams. So we should anticipate Jaylen Brown, Malik Benson, and Ja'Kai Douglas getting most of the work at wide receiver. It's a tricky situation to parse given it's all transfers. Ja'Kai Douglas only played sparingly last year, and that's being kind. He played 288 snaps. Malik Benson, I think he was largely a failure with Alabama, but that might be a little too harsh for the kid. But I mean, his targets per route rate was so low at Alabama that I had to go in and manually adjust to get him even remotely near his prop. We're talking about a target per route rate of 10%. The position average is 19%. So on 10% of his routes, he was getting targeted. That is an extremely low percentage for Malik Benson. I still just have questions with the overall talent. How good is this player? I truly, truly don't know. But I mean, if you don't think he's made strides, unders on receiving props are live. You know, like I might even rather play Jaylen Brown just because he's a young kid. He's a high recruit, but he's an unknown. We do have a Malik Benson sample, and it's not good. So I don't know what to really think there, especially when this could just be a very heavy rushing attack. The strength of Florida State is their offensive line. Uiagalelei's a player that has been game managed before, so I'm not sure what we're getting. But I guess to rank these players, if you are making a concession with Florida State, I prefer it to be Malik Benson. I'd rather go down and play like a Jaylen Brown or a Ja'Kai Douglas. But I like betting on the unknown upside of a Jaylen Brown who's gotten a lot of hype in camp. At tight end, Kyle Morlock is back. And I think there's a chance he plays a pretty good amount. So obviously no Jaheim Bell for Florida State. But they don't really have a lot of backups. It's Brian Courtney, Jackson West, players we don't really know that well. Morlock played a lot last year, over 45% of the routes with Jaheim Bell. They ran 12 personnel quite a bit. He's an interesting dart throw. On the Georgia Tech side, we just have two absolute studs back, known commodities in Rutherford and Singleton. You look to last year, these players were extreme contributors. Two best receivers on the team for the most part. We had Singleton at 714 yards. Sorry, I was reading the wrong name there. Rutherford at 502. Both had awesome efficiency and targets per route rate well above average. Behind them, expecting Chase Lane to be the primary wide receiver 3, but he should probably split some time with Christian Leary, Bailey Stockton, Abdul Jen, and Leo Blackburn. They did rotate their ancillary receivers a bit last year, so I think that'll be the case with a slight preference to Chase Lane. But ultimately, we talked about salary. I don't think it matters a ton on this slate, so it is very easy to just prioritize a Singleton, or if you can't find that, go down to Rutherford, save yourself the $100. I know it doesn't really go that far. But you look at the price gap, like Chase Lane at $4,700, I'm just going to find that $600 to get to Singleton, the $500 to get to Rutherford. Those are the primary plays I want to get to with such a condensed target share for this team. Leary, not too much interest. Tight end situation, it's likely to be a nasty rotation after they lost Brett Seither for the year. They listed co-starters in Avery Boyd and Jackson Hawes. He's one of their transfers. But they also listed 3 backups, and they have 2 transfers and a 4-star recruit there. Last year, nasty rotation at tight end, expecting this to be very much the same in this instance. So not too interested in the tight ends outside of Showdown. Avery Boyd, I saw, is very cheap there. Might throw a dart. But let's get to our second game. Sorry, I'll go back to quarterbacks first, and then we will change the teams. Let's do SMU Nevada second. Okay. This is interesting to talk about because of SMU's offseason additions. This team is so deep. They announced that we are going to see a quarterback rotation, or at least see 2 players in the game. Right now, we have Preston Stone for 80% of the snaps, Kevin Jennings for 20%. This is going to vary. I'm not sure where it shakes out. Honestly, you could see a 50-50 split. You could see as much as a 90-10 split. All we know is they're going to play together. We don't know how much. And the reason they're doing this, Kevin Jennings had very good efficiency metrics last year, which is a reason I don't understand the line movement. If you look and see, there wasn't a drastic drop-off when Jennings came in. He was actually the 53rd most efficient quarterback in the country, which is better than a ton of teams. But to retain him, I'm sure they had to not only pay him NIL money, but promise him some playing time. Otherwise, he'd probably be at a school like Vanderbilt or something. But he's back. So we're going to see both. I think both of them run a little bit. Stone's coming off the season-ending injury, so maybe he runs a little bit less. He was at 3.2 yards per carry. Jennings was solid on the ground as well. He was at 3.8. So I do think you see a decent floor for these players in terms of rushing, but this all comes down to how much you think they play. I'm going to definitely rely on what we see around the industry, probably make more of my decision on this on Saturday morning. I'm interested in Stone if people aren't going to play him. I'm going to play less of him if I see he's highly owned. All this comes down to just the uncertainty with the SMU playing time. Jennings, I think, is live if you want to just throw a complete dart in the largest of fields because he might play up to half the game. They're 24.5-point favorites, should be more. They're going to smash this Nevada team. On the other side, from a talent perspective, the worst signal caller on the slate is Brendan Lewis. I'm not sure. He's in his 5th year now. I'm not sure why they went with him. I guess this largely just comes down to health stuff. I thought Chuba Purdy might win the job, but he hasn't been able to practice. So we go with Lewis. He is a poor game manager overall. He does run the ball well, formerly of Colorado. You look at his efficiency metrics, 55% completion, 5.6 yards per attempt. I mean, this is really bad. Efficiency-wise, he was the 150th most efficient quarterback among 178 qualifiers, just putrid efficiency stuff. They're massive underdogs with the lowest implied team total on the slate. So if you're getting a little sticker shock based on this projection, don't be. You're reliant heavily on his rushing ability, which still comes out to be extremely low given how little points this team is expected to score, actually. And SMU is an elite defense, even in this conference. So not a ton of interest in Lewis. Going to the running back position, I'm expecting a lot of timeshares from both teams. On the SMU side, they lost Kamar Wheaton for the year. They listed a 3-way committee between Brashard Smith, LJ Johnson, Jalen Knighton. Knighton led the team last year. I would tentatively expect him to do so again this year, followed by LJ Johnson and Brashard Smith, the transfer from Miami, who is coming over and changing positions. He's formerly a receiver. So that's interesting right away. Brashard Smith is an excellent background catching the ball. So I think on the rare third downs that he plays, or I guess the rare third downs SMU is in, you probably see more Brashard Smith than we had seen previously. But they're going to smash this team. All three are going to get opportunities. I think you even see the freshman, Derek McFall, the 4-star. He's not in the DK player pool, but he's on FanDuel. And just because the depth chart the team released only had 3 backs, that doesn't mean only 3 are going to play. SMU often used 4 or 5 last year in competitive games, which very much could be the case again here. So I love throwing darts on players that aren't expensive or highly owned in this situation, Brashard Smith being someone to look at. On the Nevada side, also expecting the committee, this is a complete disaster. Sean Dollars led the team last year. He's back, but they add a dynamic Texas transfer in Savion Red. I don't know how much he plays, but I expect it to be a fair amount, being he's probably the most talented. Their third stringer listed was Caleb Ramseur, which was a surprise because Ashton Hayes played that role a little bit last year. And they also have some transfers. Kai Wood comes in, Destin Hawkins comes in, Pat Garwo is still hurt, but none of Kai Woods or Hawkins was listed on the depth chart. That makes them 4th string at best in a game where they're going to get slaughtered. Just not too much to see here. For me, it's maybe throwing a dart on red because of price, or in GPPs, it would have to be pretty big GPP, but dollars perhaps. Not my favorite plays overall. Pass catchers, this is very tricky for both teams. A lot of consistency with SMU, which may or may not be good. A lot of change for Nevada, which may or may not be good. Let's start with SMU. This team returns almost everybody, and if you remember from last year, that might not be a good thing. Basically, your top 7 pass catchers are back. They lose a rotational guy here or there, but they listed 6 co-starters at receiver between Jake Bailey, Roderick Daniels, Romello Brinson, Jordan Hudson, Keyshawn Smith, and Moochie Dixon. Their tight end, RJ Maryland, is back. For some context, who led the team in route rate last year, just percentage of routes they were on the field? That was their tight end. It was RJ Maryland. What was the route rate? It was 66%, which speaks to the rotation of this team. And the only reason RJ Maryland led that is because they weren't as deep at tight end. They have a few transfers this year. Matthew Hibner coming in from Michigan. Perhaps it is more of a rotation. I doubt it. I think RJ Maryland is the safest player on this team, but I think he doesn't have the highest ceiling, as you can see in our projections. Jordan Hudson and Jake Bailey were the most efficient. Their route rates hovered between 55 and 60% on most games, but Jordan Hudson was by far the most efficient receiver, so he gets a slight projection bump. It's even a little more than slight here. Bailey would be second. Once you get below these players, this is where things get tricky. I'm interested in Romello Brinson just because of price, 4,100. He was more efficient than a guy who played more in Keyshawn Smith. Smith played the third most of these returners at wide receiver specifically, but he was one of the least efficient. Moochie Dixon kind of brings up the rear for these players. Roderick Daniels is interesting because they use him as a gadget player. He'll get some snaps on the ground, occasionally a carry here or there, which is worth mentioning. So I would say Brinson Daniels for salary savers make more sense to me. But this is another thing like the QBs. I'm just going to wait and see who's heavily owned and probably throw some darts at some players that aren't as heavily owned. We saw that with a Moochie Dixon slate last year where he caught a few touchdowns, was unowned, but plays just as much as guys like Bailey and Hudson. Nevada brings in an entirely new receiving core. Their listed starters are Jaden Smith, Cortez Braham, the West Virginia transfer, and Marcus Bellin, the UTEP transfer. I think Smith is probably the most interesting just because he's probably the most unknown. Braham was a JUCO transfer to West Virginia. West Virginia was his only Power 5 offer. He couldn't get on the field, so now he transfers back down to Nevada. And Bellin is like a special teamer from UTEP coming up. What I'll say here is I expect this to be fairly condensed. Their backups are Nate Burles in the second, Marshawn Brown. Don't expect a ton from those guys. Perhaps you could convince me they siphon off a little more. But at the end of the day, this is still a very bad passing attack. And I definitely don't want more than one Nevada receiver in my lineups, especially because their quarterback is atrocious and can't throw the ball forward. As far as tight ends, Jace Henry was listed as the starter, but they have a Florida transfer behind him. I think this is likely more of a rotation than we want it to be. Let's finish out with our last game before my computer dies. Montana State takes on New Mexico. This is a fun game overall, FCS versus FBS. We have a team that throws the ball about 33% of the time in Montana State. That's why their quarterback, Tommy Mellett, projects extremely well. They're an 11.5 point favorite over New Mexico. The total is 54.5. The reason why SMU projects so well, even their rotations, is they're a 24.5 point favorite. But this Montana State team, they look awesome overall. So a couple things to get to first with them. They don't exactly run like an option attack, but they're extremely, extremely heavy to the run. And then from there, they use a lot of 12 personnel. So receivers aren't on the field as much as some other teams. When you look at them, they return a lot of production in their skill players. Their offensive line is banged up. They only have 2 returning starters. A third is injured and not going to play in this game. Their leading running back, Julius Davis, is going to be injured too. So when you look at Tommy Mellett, this is a guy that was dynamic on the ground last year, averaged over 8 yards per carry. He's going to get more of an opportunity. They lost their full-time starter. And when they throw the ball, we're expecting it to be efficient based on this game total. So right away, he should be one of the players we look at immediately. I like using him and one of the players from the Florida State game, whether it's Haynes King or Uagalele, that's up to you. But I think we have the safest floor, maybe not the best ceiling just because they're not going to throw the ball a ton, but worth mentioning. Devon Dampier, the New Mexico quarterback, is playing with a deficit here, but he showed a lot in a very limited sample last year, and he showed a lot on the ground. So he's someone I think we can use in GPPs, especially 62.5% completion percentage, but 5.6 yards per attempt. He would have been the 40th most efficient quarterback had he played enough. He just did not. So GPPs, I think we can use him. Just a little nervous because they're such big underdogs. In the run game for these two teams, already hinted at some of the injuries for Montana State. Take this with a grain of salt because I'm not sure I trust the depth chart that much. They listed Scott Trey Humphrey as the starter, Adam Jones as the backup. Jared White and Elijah Elliott played more last year, but they were not listed. Again, they only listed 2 guys. That doesn't mean these guys aren't going to play. Just worth noting, I don't know what they do. This is all because Julius Davis is out of the game, the former Wisconsin transfer. which I think hurts this team immediately. But I mean, just from a projection standpoint, I'm going based on the depth chart and projecting Scottre Humphrey to lead it. He's listed as the starter, Jones to be second in line. And then we gave a handful of carries to Jared White and Elliott based on what they did last year. So that's how this breaks down. But Scottre and Adam Jones are very live to play. New Mexico brings back Andrew Henry, but they added Eli Sanders and Nakari Rogers, who comes from the FCS ranks. I think this is just a full-blown three-way committee. That's how they had it listed on the depth chart. So if you go based on that, Nakari Rogers is very interesting at 3K. I'm just not sure you need to go all the way down there. Sanders probably is the most talent. He's an Iowa State transfer, but they still listed Henry above, and he is the incumbent. So that's worth mentioning. I will say this could change throughout the week. Don't write this in stone, especially. Not if you even want to play a New Mexico running back. I'm not sure I would advocate that. Last up, tight end, wide receiver. So the only player who was listed without an or designation on the depth chart for New Mexico was Luke Wysong, which is very interesting. I'm not sure why they did this because I would have thought we'd see Caleb Medford, the incumbent leader on the team, be listed as a starter all to himself, but he was not. He was a co-starter with Nick Trujillo, and then Sean Miller was listed as a co-starter with Ryan Davis. So I don't know. We tentatively are following the depth chart with Wysong ahead of those players, but I would be very interested in Medford if he comes in lower owned, and Ryan Davis, both who were proven commodities last year. You just don't really know what you're getting out of this New Mexico passing attack. I have less interest in the Trujillo and some of those deeper receivers. Tight end Trace Bruckler is the full-time starter. He rotated last year with Hunter and Gears, so we're kind of projecting a rotation at tight end as well for New Mexico. Very uninspiring receiver group. And I'm not even confident in the Wysong projection. This is based strictly on the depth chart. Montana State, again, they don't throw the ball often, but they have such a high implied team total that the receivers project decently. Ty McCullough is a Colorado State transfer. Lanyata Alexander is a Washington transfer. Those will be your top two on the team. They listed Taco Dowler as their wide receiver 3 on the depth chart, which was a surprise because players like Jacob Trimble, Aiden Garrigan, they played more last year. So similar to the running back situation, I wouldn't be shocked to see a rotation. So if you want to throw darts on some of these guys, it does make sense. Ryan Longren should be the tight end for this team, followed by Hunter Proviance. Rohan Jones is actually a fullback. He was a transfer that came in, so not really much to see there. He should be playing that fullback position. But I think that'll do it for all of the players on this slate. If you have questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments or follow me on Twitter. I'm at Matt_Gajewski. Happy to answer anything you might have. My DMs are open. And we'll have our college football package up. There will be more details on that in the future. Check the links below in the description. Otherwise, thank you guys for watching. Happy to be back. And we will do this for every slate throughout the year. Until next time, we will see you guys later. Have a good one.